The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows as Sarah Mitchell's mother, Jennifer, clutched her daughter's tiny hand. The golden light illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, creating an almost serene backdrop to what was anything but peaceful. At 3 years old, Sarah wore a pink dress her grandmother had bought her, the one with the white lace collar that made her look like a tiny doll. She didn't understand the significance of this day, didn't comprehend that the words being spoken in this imposing room would determine how many nights she'd sleep in her father's house, how many birthdays he'd miss, or how much of her childhood he'd get to witness. To Sarah, it was just another confusing day where the adults around her were tense and speaking in serious voices. Jennifer's stomach twisted with anxiety as she watched her daughter look around the courtroom with wide, innocent eyes. She squeezed Sarah's hand gently, offering reassurance she didn't entirely feel herself. The oak-paneled walls seemed to close in on her, and the musty smell of old law books and leather chairs made her nauseous. She had been dreading this hearing for weeks, losing sleep at night, running through scenarios in her mind. Would the judge believe her? Would they see Michael for who he really was, or would they fall for his charming act? Michael sat across the room at the defendant's table, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his hair slicked back with product that probably cost more than Jennifer spent on groceries in a month. His expression was one of calculated confidence, that infuriating smirk playing at the corners of his mouth that she had grown to despise. He looked every bit the successful real estate developer he pretended to be, the kind of man who believed that money and appearance could buy innocence. Next to him sat his attorney, Thomas Bradford, a shark in designer glasses who had successfully defended 3 other men in similar custody disputes. Bradford had a reputation for being ruthless, for finding ways to discredit accusers and paint fathers as victims of vindictive mothers. Jennifer had read about some of his cases. He always won. Their marriage had ended in bitterness 2 years ago, but the custody fight that followed had become something uglier, something more personal and brutal than Jennifer could have imagined. What had started as a simple separation had transformed into a full-scale war, complete with private investigators, psychological evaluations, and character witnesses. Michael had contested everything: the amount of child support, the visitation schedule, even Jennifer's fitness as a primary caregiver. He had suggested to the court that Jennifer was keeping Sarah from him out of spite, that she had poisoned their daughter against him. The accusations stung because they were so far from the truth, yet spoken with such conviction that Jennifer sometimes wondered if anyone would believe her. The gallery behind them held a handful of spectators: Jennifer's mother, who had taken off work to be there, her best friend who had offered moral support, and a man in the back row who Jennifer recognized as Michael's new girlfriend, sat with her legs crossed, checking her phone every few minutes, seemingly bored by the proceedings. Jennifer felt a flash of anger at the woman's indifference. This was her stepdaughter's life being decided, and she couldn't even put her phone away for an hour. Judge entered through a side door, her black robes flowing behind her like a cloak of authority. She was a stern-faced woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had been on the bench for 28 years and had presided over thousands of cases. Her reputation preceded her. She was fair but unforgiving, detailed in her analysis, and completely intolerant of lies or manipulation. Jennifer had actually felt some relief when they drew Judge. She was known for seeing through deception, and Jennifer believed that the truth would speak for itself. The bailiff called the case Mitchell versus Mitchell, custody modification hearing, and the formalities began. Sarah suddenly became very still in Jennifer's lap, sensing the shift in atmosphere. She had been to these hearings before, and while she didn't understand the legal terminology, she understood that they were about her, that the grown-ups were fighting about her, and that made her small body tense with anxiety. Michael's attorney stood first, laying out their position with practiced eloquence. He argued that Michael had been unfairly limited in his time with Sarah, that Jennifer was using the child as a weapon, and that the existing custody arrangement was biased against fathers. He painted Michael as a devoted parent who only wanted to spend more time with his beloved daughter. The words flowed smoothly, almost hypnotically. He spoke about Michael's financial stability, his spacious home with a backyard perfect for children, his successful business that would provide Sarah with every advantage. Jennifer's lawyer, Santos, sat beside them taking notes, was younger than Bradford, perhaps in her late 40s, but she had a reputation for being brilliant with family law. She had warned Jennifer that this hearing would be challenging, that the courts often favored fathers seeking increased visitation, that the system was biased. Sarah began to fidget, swinging her legs back and forth under the chair. Jennifer whispered to her to sit still, and Sarah, but her eyes grew tired and confused. The hearing was scheduled to last 3 hours, but they were only 30 minutes in. Jennifer knew this was going to be exhausting for everyone, especially for Sarah. She had wanted to leave Sarah with her mother, but her attorney insisted that the judge should see them together, that the bond between mother and daughter was important for the proceedings. Michael glanced back at them occasionally, his expression unreadable. When his eyes met Jennifer's, she felt that old, familiar pit of dread in her stomach. She knew things about Michael that she couldn't prove in court, behaviors that didn't leave physical marks or evidence. She knew about the way he spoke to Sarah when he thought no one was listening, the harsh tone he took with her over minor mistakes. She knew about the times he had brought her back from visitation with bruises on her arms, claiming she had fallen while playing. She knew about the incidents that Sarah had described to her teachers, fragments of stories that suggested something darker was happening behind closed doors. But knowing and proving were two very different things in a courtroom. The judge opened her leather notebook and began writing, her pen moving across the pages in quick, decisive strokes. Jennifer couldn't read her expression. Was she sympathetic, skeptical, bored? The uncertainty was torture. This was the woman who would decide Sarah's future, who would determine whether Michael got more time with her, whether Jennifer's concerns would be taken seriously, whether her daughter would be safe. As the morning wore on, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker, more suffocating. Michael's attorney was skillfully dismantling Jennifer's character, suggesting she was emotionally unstable, that her accusations were the product of a vindictive ex-wife's imagination. And then, just as things seemed to be spiraling against them, something unexpected happened. The morning had dragged on interminably, each minute feeling like an hour as Michael's attorney continued his systematic dismantling of Jennifer's credibility. Santos had stood to present their defense, but the damage had already been done. The judge's expression remained neutral, impossible to read. Jennifer felt her hope slipping away with every passing moment. She could see it in her mother's face too, the growing concern that this hearing wasn't going the way they'd hoped, that the judge might actually be swayed by Michael's polished presentation and expensive legal team. Sarah had become increasingly restless in Jennifer's lap. The courtroom's rigid formality was suffocating for a 3-year-old who couldn't understand why her parents were fighting, who couldn't comprehend the legal arguments bouncing back and forth like tennis balls. She had begun humming softly, a habit she did when she was nervous or bored. Jennifer had gently shushed her, running her fingers through Sarah's curls in a soothing gesture. The little girl leaned back against her mother's chest, her small body radiating the tension she had absorbed from the adults around her. Judge had been making notes throughout the morning, her pen scratching across the pages of her legal pad. Jennifer had found herself watching the judge intently, trying to read between the lines of her expressions, desperately searching for some sign that she understood the truth of the situation. Was the judge taking their concerns seriously? Or was she buying into Michael's narrative that Jennifer was a scorned woman trying to keep him from his daughter? It was around 10:47 a.m. when Officer Davis arrived. The bailiff had mentioned earlier that there was another case scheduled in the afternoon, a drug possession case involving a K-9 unit. The officer had been asked to arrive early with his dog to ensure everything was ready for that hearing. Few people in the courtroom had paid attention to this announcement. It seemed like an administrative detail, something inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Officer Davis entered through the rear courtroom door, and with him came K9 Badge, one of the most impressively trained German shepherds in the entire county police department. Badge was massive, easily 90 pounds of pure muscle, his coat a perfect blend of black and tan, his ears alert and pointed. The dog moved with military precision beside Officer Davis, his training evident in every step. Badge was a living weapon, trained to detect drugs, to apprehend suspects, to protect his handler. But he was also exceptionally well-behaved, moving silently through the courtroom as though he understood the gravity of the proceedings. The bailiff directed Officer Davis to wait near his station at the front of the courtroom. The dog would have to remain on a short leash throughout the morning's proceedings until it was time for the next case. Officer Davis nodded, understanding the routine. He had done this countless times before. He positioned himself and Badge at the side of the courtroom, out of the way but visible, the dog standing at perfect attention beside him. The judge barely glanced up as the officer and dog settled into their spot. The hearing continued. Michael's attorney was in the middle of a particularly cutting remark about Jennifer's tendency toward exaggeration when something remarkable happened. Sarah's entire body went rigid. Her humming stopped abruptly. Jennifer felt the sudden tension and looked down at her daughter, wondering what had caused such an instant change. Sarah's eyes had widened to enormous circles, all her earlier boredom and restlessness evaporating in an instant. Her small mouth opened slightly, and her head turned with mechanical precision toward the side of the courtroom where Officer Davis and K9 Badge stood. For a moment, Jennifer didn't understand what had captured her daughter's attention so completely. Then she followed Sarah's gaze and saw the dog. Of course, Sarah loved dogs. They had talked about getting one someday, though Michael had always refused, saying it would be too much trouble. Sarah had seen the occasional dog on walks or in parks, and she always became animated, always wanted to pet and play. But this was different. This wasn't simple childhood enthusiasm. This was something more intense, more focused. Sarah began to squirm in Jennifer's lap, but not with restlessness this time. She was leaning forward, her small body straining toward the dog as though pulled by an invisible cord. Her eyes remained locked on Badge with an intensity that was almost mesmerizing. Jennifer had never seen her daughter respond to anything quite like this before. Judge noticed the movement and paused mid-sentence. Her sharp eyes flicked from Sarah to the dog and back again. Most judges would have simply continued with the proceedings, perhaps noted the distraction and moved on. But Judge was not most judges. She had spent 28 years observing human behavior in her courtroom, reading the subtle shifts in demeanor that often revealed truth more clearly than words ever could. She noticed everything: the nervous habits, the defensive postures, the genuine emotional responses that people couldn't fake no matter how hard they tried. Sarah began to make small, excited sounds, barely audible. She was practically vibrating with anticipation in her mother's lap. Jennifer whispered urgently to her, trying to keep her still, but Sarah wasn't interested in sitting quietly anymore. The fear and confusion that had clouded her face moments earlier had been replaced with something else: focus, recognition, perhaps even relief. The courtroom had become aware of the disturbance. Michael's attorney paused in his presentation, glancing back to see what had caused the disruption. The bailiff straightened, wondering if there would be a problem. Even Officer Davis noticed, looking slightly embarrassed that his dog was causing a scene. Badge, for his part, remained perfectly still, trained to ignore distractions, standing sentinel at his handler's side. What happened next would change the course of the entire hearing. Sarah suddenly threw her small arm up with surprising force, her tiny finger extending with absolute certainty toward the massive police dog. Her voice, which had been quiet and hesitant moments before, suddenly rang out through the courtroom with crystal clarity. It was a voice stripped of childish uncertainty, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper, somewhere more fundamental than a 3-year-old's innocent observations. Her words cut through the courtroom like a knife, each syllable distinct and undeniable. Jennifer gasped, her hands freezing on Sarah's shoulders. The color drained from Michael's face. His attorney stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. The bailiff's eyes widened. Officer Davis blinked, confused about why the child was pointing at his dog. Even Judge set down her pen slowly, her sharp eyes narrowing as she focused entirely on the small child. The two words Sarah had spoken hung in the air like an accusation, like a confession, like a desperate plea for help that had finally found its voice. The implications of those two simple words would spiral outward like ripples in a pond, eventually creating waves that would transform everything. Judge's expression shifted. Her practiced judicial neutrality cracked, replaced by something more human, more visceral. She had heard something in Sarah's voice that transcended the words themselves. She had heard absolute truth and terrible fear combined into one devastating statement. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Bad man." Sarah's voice rang through the courtroom with surprising clarity and conviction. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, freezing everyone in place as though time itself had momentarily stopped. The echo of her small voice seemed to reverberate off the oak-paneled walls, bouncing back and forth in the stunned silence that followed. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning system and the rapid beating of several hearts, accelerating with shock and recognition. Jennifer's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks so quickly that she thought she might faint. Her mother let out a small gasp from the gallery behind them, one hand flying to her mouth. Reached over and squeezed hand, both women understanding immediately what had just happened, what those two words meant. This wasn't a confused child making a random statement. This was Sarah, their Sarah, finally finding her voice, finally expressing something that had been bottled up inside her for far too long. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. His face transformed in an instant from confident smugness to something darker, more desperate. His jaw clenched so tightly that Jennifer could see the muscles working beneath his skin. His hands balled into fists at his sides, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he might actually lunge forward. His attorney, Bradford, quickly grabbed his arm and pulled him back down into his seat, hissing urgent whispers that no one else could hear. Whatever instructions the lawyer was giving him, they were clearly designed to damage control, to minimize what had just transpired. The bailiff exchanged bewildered glances with Officer Davis, both men clearly uncertain about what was happening. This was a custody hearing, not a criminal proceeding. A 3-year-old pointing at a police dog and making an accusation was completely outside the normal protocol. Officer Davis took a subtle step back, suddenly uncomfortable with the role his dog had inadvertently played in this dramatic revelation. Badge, still perfectly trained and obedient, remained motionless, completely unaware of the emotional earthquake his presence had triggered. Judge's pen stopped mid-stroke. Her hand froze above the legal pad she had been writing on for the past several hours. For a long moment she didn't move at all, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. Her sharp eyes, which had been coolly observant throughout the morning, suddenly came alive with something Jennifer couldn't quite identify. Was it recognition, concern, suspicion? The judge's expression shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But Jennifer was watching closely, had been watching the judge's every micro-expression throughout the hearing, searching for any sign that they were being heard. What Judge had heard in Sarah's voice was something that transcended the simple words themselves. She had detected the absolute certainty of a child speaking truth, the raw fear that underscored every syllable, and the desperate clarity that comes only from genuine experience. In her 28 years on the bench, the judge had learned to distinguish between children who were coached, who were confused, or who were repeating things they had overheard. This was none of those things. Sarah's statement carried the unmistakable weight of something real, something true, something that had shaped her young understanding of the world. Sarah wasn't looking at the dog anymore. Her small finger remained pointed, but her eyes had shifted. She was looking directly at her father across the courtroom, her gaze unwavering despite the fact that he was staring at her with an expression she had clearly learned to fear. Jennifer felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. This was what her daughter had been carrying inside her, this fear, this knowledge, this desperate need to warn people about the bad man in her life. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the ambient sound seemed to pause. The hum of the air conditioning faded. The ticking of the large clock on the wall became inaudible. The rustling of papers and movement of bodies all stopped. It was the kind of absolute silence that only happens when something monumental has occurred, when the normal rules of engagement have been violated, when truth has forced its way through all the carefully constructed pretense. Judge slowly set down her pen. The movement was deliberate, measured, controlled. She removed her reading glasses and set them on top of her legal pad. Then, with the authority that came from nearly 3 decades of judicial experience, she began to speak. Her voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel, a tone that commanded absolute attention and obedience. "I'm going to order a brief recess," Judge announced, her words measured and precise. "This hearing will pause for 30 minutes. Officer Davis, I appreciate your presence here today, but I need to ask you to remove K9 badge from the courtroom immediately. The dog's presence appears to be causing a distraction." Officer Davis nodded quickly, clearly relieved to have a reason to exit the emotionally charged atmosphere. He signaled to Badge, and the dog immediately rose to his feet, moving with perfect military precision toward the rear exit. Within moments, they were gone, the dog that had inadvertently triggered this revelation removed from the scene. Judge turned her attention to Michael's attorney. "Mr. Bradford, I would suggest you have a serious conversation with your client. Something significant has just occurred in my courtroom, and it demands to be addressed." There was a finality to her tone that left no room for negotiation or argument. Bradford's face flushed with frustration and confusion. He leaned toward Michael, speaking urgently in hushed tones, clearly trying to salvage whatever remained of their case. The judge then looked directly at Jennifer and spoke with deliberate gentleness, her tone completely different from the one she had used with the defense attorney. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to speak with your daughter, not in an official capacity, not as testimony, but as a concerned observer. I need to understand what prompted that statement. This will not be interrogation. Her court-appointed guardian ad will be present, as will you, if you wish. We will speak in my private chambers, in a safe and comfortable environment." Santos leaned over and whispered something to Jennifer, who nodded, tears streaming down her face. She lifted Sarah carefully from her lap and carried her toward Judge's chambers, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, as though she were walking through a dream. Sarah clung to her mother, suddenly frightened by the attention she had drawn, suddenly aware that something significant had happened, though she couldn't possibly comprehend the magnitude of it. She buried her face in Jennifer's shoulder, but there was also something else in her small body. A release, perhaps even relief that someone had finally heard her, that the truth had finally escaped from the place where it had been locked away inside her. As Jennifer carried Sarah through the door to Judge's private chambers, she realized that everything had changed in those 2 words. The entire trajectory of their case, the custody battle, Sarah's future, all of it had shifted on its axis. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, the truth was finally out in the light. Judge's private chambers were a stark contrast to the intimidating formality of the courtroom. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and instead of the harsh fluorescent lighting outside, warm lamps created pools of gentle illumination. A comfortable sofa lined one wall, and several overstuffed chairs were positioned around a low coffee table. There were even stuffed animals in one corner, a collection that Judge kept specifically for situations like this, for when children needed to feel safe and secure rather than threatened and overwhelmed. Sarah entered the room clutching her mother's hand, her eyes wide and uncertain. Jennifer knelt down to her daughter's level, whispering reassurances that everything was okay, that the nice judge lady just wanted to talk. Sarah's bottom lip trembled slightly, and she buried her face in her mother's shoulder for a moment before pulling back and looking around the room with cautious curiosity. Santos, the court-appointed guardian ad and judge, stood waiting near the sofa. The guardian ad was a woman named, in her mid-50s, with kind eyes and an experienced demeanor. She had worked with hundreds of children over her career and knew exactly how to create an environment of safety and trust. She had seen the worst of what parents could do to their children, and she recognized genuine distress when she saw it. Judge gestured toward the sofa. "Sarah, would you like to sit here? We have some very comfortable cushions, and I have some coloring books over there if you'd like to draw something while we talk." She pointed to a shelf lined with children's books and art supplies. Her voice was warm, almost grandmotherly, completely stripped of the authoritative tone she used in the courtroom. Sarah looked up at her mother questioningly. Jennifer nodded encouragement, and they both sat on the sofa. Sat in an armchair nearby, keeping a respectful distance but close enough to observe and support if needed. Judge settled into a second chair, positioning herself at Sarah's eye level rather than looming above her. "Sarah, my name is Judge, but you can just call me if you'd like. I'm not going to ask you hard questions or make you feel scared. I just want to understand something that happened in the courtroom today. Do you remember pointing at the dog?" Judge began gently, her experienced eyes studying the child carefully. Sarah nodded slowly, her thumb moving toward her mouth, a classic self-soothing gesture. "That was very brave," Judge continued. "You said 2 words. Do you remember what those words were?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Bad man." Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. Hearing those words again, spoken directly by her daughter in this quiet, intimate setting, made the reality of the situation even more painful. "Can you tell me who the bad man is?" Judge asked, her tone remaining gentle and non-judgmental. Sarah pointed toward the courtroom, in the general direction where her father had been sitting. She didn't say his name, but she didn't need to. Judge nodded thoughtfully. "Sarah, has this bad man ever done something that made you feel scared or sad?" Sarah nodded, her eyes beginning to fill with tears. Her lip quivered as she looked at her mother, seeking reassurance. Jennifer wrapped her arm around her daughter, pulling her close and whispering that it was okay to talk, that she was safe here. "Sometimes Daddy says mean things," Sarah said, her words coming slowly as though she was pulling them from deep within herself. He says I'm bad. He says I'm a mistake." His expression tightened, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with Judge. These were serious statements from a 3-year-old, and they suggested a pattern of verbal and emotional abuse rather than isolated incidents. Judge leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, when your daddy says these things, how do they make you feel?" "Scared," Sarah whispered. "I feel scared and sad. My tummy hurts when I know I have to go to his house." Jennifer closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. This was what she had suspected, what she had tried to tell people, what she could sense in Sarah's anxiety and behavioral changes. But hearing her daughter articulate it, even in this fragmented, childlike way, was devastating. "Has he ever touched you in a way that hurt you or made you uncomfortable?" Judge asked, her voice remaining calm and professional even as she asked one of the most critical questions. Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she slowly pulled up her sleeve, revealing small bruises on her upper arm. "He grabbed me. He said I was being bad because I spilled my juice." Made a note in her file. These were the kinds of details that could be documented, that could support an investigation. Judge's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of her emotional reaction to what she was hearing. Over the next 30 minutes, Judge conducted what amounted to a gentle but thorough investigation. She didn't lead Sarah with suggestions or put words in her mouth. Instead, she asked open-ended questions and allowed the child to share her experience in her own words, in her own time. What emerged was a picture of a father who used harsh language, emotional manipulation, and occasional physical roughness as parenting techniques. Michael apparently called Sarah names when she made mistakes, told her she was unwanted and unlovable, and used intimidation to control her behavior during visits. Sarah described how she would feel nervous as the visitation time approached, how she would sometimes ask her mother if she had to go, how she dreaded being alone with her father. She talked about him yelling, about the fear she felt in her chest, about how much better she felt when she was with her mother and grandmother. Judge listened to every word, made careful notes, and asked follow-up questions when necessary. By the end of the conversation, a clear pattern had emerged, not of a loving, devoted father eager to spend time with his daughter, but of an abusive, controlling man using his parental access to emotionally harm a vulnerable child. When the questioning was complete, Judge stood and knelt down to Sarah's level. "Sarah, I want you to know that you did something very brave today. You told the truth, and telling the truth is one of the most important things we can do. I'm going to make sure that you're safe. That's my job, and I take it very seriously." She looked at Jennifer and, "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services immediately. I want an investigation opened into the home environment during Mr. Mitchell's visitation. In the meantime, I'm suspending his unsupervised visitation rights effective immediately. No contact between Mr. Mitchell and Sarah until we've had a proper investigation." As they left Judge's chambers, Jennifer held Sarah close, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Her daughter had been brave enough to tell the truth, and now, finally, someone in a position of power was taking her seriously. The legal battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time since the custody fight had started, Jennifer felt a glimmer of hope that justice might actually prevail. Judge watched them leave, then immediately picked up her phone. She had calls to make, investigations to initiate, and a duty to protect a child who had finally found her voice. The investigation that Judge initiated moved with surprising speed and efficiency. Within 24 hours, Child Protective Services had opened a formal case file on Michael Mitchell. What started as a routine inquiry quickly spiraled into something far more serious, as investigators began pulling the threads of his life, examining the fabric of his interactions with Sarah, and discovering a pattern of emotional abuse that had been carefully concealed behind closed doors. The lead investigator was a woman named Detective Sarah, a seasoned professional who had spent 12 years investigating child abuse cases. She had seen the worst of human behavior and developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize the signs of abuse, both obvious and subtle. Approached Michael's case with methodical precision, starting with the most basic step, interviewing teachers and school staff who had regular contact with Sarah. Sarah's preschool teacher, Mrs. Finch, was one of the first people spoke with. Mrs. Finch had been teaching at Sunshine Valley Preschool for 18 years and had seen hundreds of children pass through her classroom. She knew when something was wrong. She had kept detailed notes about Sarah's behavior, the anxiety that manifested during pickup times when Michael was scheduled to collect her, the way Sarah's whole body would tense when she saw his car in the parking lot, the nightmare Sarah had mentioned to her classmates. "Sarah becomes a completely different child when she knows her father is picking her up," Mrs. Finch told Detective, pulling out her classroom journal. "She's normally bright and playful, but on those days she becomes withdrawn and anxious. She's had several incidents of regression, which she hasn't done in over a year. Once, she had a full panic attack when I mentioned that her father would be picking her up early." Took careful notes, her pen moving across her notepad in quick, precise strokes. "Has Sarah ever mentioned why she feels this way? Has she said anything specific about her time with her father?" "Not much, because she's so young and has difficulty articulating complex emotions," Mrs. Finch explained. "But there was one incident that troubled me deeply. About 3 weeks ago, another child in the class bumped into Sarah and she flinched violently. When I asked if she was okay, she said, Daddy says I'm bad. I asked her what she meant and she just clammed up. But the way she said it, there was such fear and sadness in her voice. Detective's suspicions began to solidify. This was consistent with emotional abuse, with a child being told she was bad, unworthy, a burden. The anxiety responses were classic symptoms of a child living in fear of a parental figure. Next, interviewed the pediatrician who had treated Sarah for various minor illnesses over the past year. Dr. James's records revealed something significant. Sarah had been brought in 3 times with stress-related symptoms, tension headaches, stomach aches with no medical cause, and sleep disturbances. Each time, the symptoms had occurred after visitation with her father. Interestingly, Dr. told, reviewing his notes, I asked Ms. Mitchell about any changes in Sarah's home environment or any stressful situations. She mentioned the custody dispute and the increased visitation schedule with the father. She expressed concern that Sarah seemed anxious before and after visits. I recommended continuing monitoring and possibly counseling, but I should have dug deeper. The investigator then began interviewing neighbors in Michael's upscale residential community. Several of them reported hearing Michael yelling at Sarah, his voice raised in anger over minor infractions. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs., reported that she had heard Michael telling Sarah, "You're worthless, and I don't know why your mother even bothered having you." These words had been so shocking that Mrs. had actually written down the date and time, troubled enough to consider reporting it, but uncertain about whether it was her place to intervene. Detective felt her anger rising as the pieces came together. This wasn't a case of a father simply using harsh discipline or having a bad temper. This was systematic, deliberate emotional abuse, the kind designed to break down a child's sense of self-worth and create dependency through fear. The investigation expanded to include Michael's therapy history, obtained the necessary court order to access his psychological records, and what she discovered was damning. Michael had been referred to anger management counseling 5 years earlier, shortly after an incident at his workplace where he had verbally abused an employee. According to his therapist's notes, Michael had issues with impulse control, a tendency toward aggression when he felt disrespected, and poor emotional regulation. His therapist had recommended he continue with treatment for at least a year. But Michael had attended only 4 sessions before dropping out, citing that he didn't need therapy and that the therapist didn't understand him. He had never completed the recommended program. The very tools he needed to manage his anger and emotional responses to fatherhood had been abandoned almost before they were begun. Detective interviewed Michael's ex-girlfriend, a woman named who had dated him for 8 months before breaking up with him. The account was particularly revealing. She described Michael's treatment of Sarah during their brief relationship, how he had been impatient and harsh, how he seemed to resent the time he had to spend with her, how he had once told Sarah that she was slowing him down when she couldn't keep up with his pace while shopping. "He wasn't abusive to me in the sense of hitting," explained, "but he was controlling and had a real problem with anger. When something didn't go his way, he would explode. I could only imagine what it would be like for a child trying to navigate that temperament. I actually broke up with him partly because I was concerned about how he treated Sarah." The most significant breakthrough came when reviewed CPS records from Michael's own childhood. Shockingly, he had grown up in a home with an abusive father, a man who used harsh language and physical punishment as parenting techniques. Michael had been removed from the home at age 14 and placed in foster care. The cycle was repeating, abuse begetting abuse, trauma perpetuating itself across generations. Compiled all of this evidence into a comprehensive report. The pattern was unmistakable: a man with a history of anger issues, a lack of emotional regulation, and a childhood marked by abuse, now using similar tactics on his own daughter. This wasn't a custody dispute between 2 parents with different parenting philosophies. This was a child protection issue, a situation where intervention was not just warranted but absolutely necessary. When detective presented her findings to judge, the judge's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes conveyed deep concern. She reviewed the documentation methodically, reading through every statement, every observation, every piece of evidence. "This is comprehensive and damning," Judge said finally. "Mr. Mitchell's unsupervised visitation must remain suspended pending further evaluation. I want a psychological evaluation of both parents, and I want Sarah to begin therapy with a trauma specialist immediately. This child needs support to process what she's experienced." The investigation had taken what Sarah said in the courtroom, 2 simple words, and transformed it into irrefutable evidence of abuse. Her voice, amplified by trained investigators and careful documentation, had become impossible to ignore. The legal machinery, once activated by Judge's instincts and her willingness to listen to a frightened child, had produced a comprehensive picture of a man who had systematically damaged his daughter's emotional. What happened next would determine Sarah's future, and potentially, the future of hundreds of other children whose voices might similarly be heard by judges willing to truly listen. The confrontation with Michael Mitchell took place in a sterile interrogation room at the Child Protective Services office. It was not the kind of comfortable, welcoming space designed for children like Judge Chambers. Instead, it was intentionally austere: gray walls, a metal table, uncomfortable chairs, and a video camera mounted in the corner recording every word, every gesture, every reaction. Detective sat across from Michael, with a CPS supervisor present as a witness. Michael's attorney, Thomas Bradford, sat beside him, his previous confidence now replaced with visible concern about the mounting evidence. Detective placed the comprehensive investigation report on the table between them. It was several inches thick, filled with statements, documentation, and damning evidence. She opened to the first page and began reading the witness statements aloud. Mrs. Finch's account of Sarah's anxiety, doctor's medical records, the neighbor's observations of Michael's harsh language, testimony about his controlling behavior. With each statement read, Michael's face grew darker, his jaw clenching. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, crossing and uncrossing his arms defensively. When reached the section about his abandoned anger management therapy, Michael finally spoke. "That's not relevant," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I didn't need therapy. That therapist was incompetent." "According to the records, your therapist specifically recommended continued treatment for anger management issues," replied calmly, maintaining professional neutrality. "You chose to discontinue after 4 sessions. Why is that?" "Because I didn't think there was anything wrong with me," Michael snapped. "I don't need someone telling me how to live my life." Bradford placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, whispering urgent instructions. But Michael was becoming increasingly agitated, his controlled facade cracking like thin ice beneath pressure. Then presented the most damaging piece of evidence: a photograph of the bruises on Sarah's arm, along with Sarah's statement that Michael had grabbed her when she spilled juice. The investigator's voice remained measured and clinical as she presented this evidence. "Your daughter reported that you grabbed her and left these bruises because she had an accident with juice. Is that accurate?" Michael stared at the photograph, and for a moment something flickered across his face, guilt perhaps, or the realization that he had been caught. "She was being careless. I corrected her." "You left bruises on a 3-year-old child's arm," said, her voice still calm but carrying an underlying edge. "That's not correction, that's physical abuse." "It's called discipline," Michael shot back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Parents discipline their children, that's not abuse." "Leaving visible bruises on a child is abuse in the eyes of the law," replied. "And that's just one incident. We have documentation of verbal abuse, emotional manipulation, and creating an environment of fear for your daughter." Bradford leaned heavily toward Michael, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. He was clearly trying to get his client to understand the gravity of his situation, to recognize that continuing to be defensive would only worsen his legal position. Bradford knew better than anyone how custody cases were decided when evidence of abuse was presented. "Michael, I need you to listen to me," Bradford said firmly. "I'm advising you to cooperate with this investigation. Anything you say can and will be used in the custody proceedings, but your cooperation now might influence how a judge views your willingness to take responsibility." Michael sat back in his chair, his shoulders sagging slightly. The fight seemed to drain out of him as the reality of the situation began to penetrate. He was caught. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no way he could talk or manipulate his way out of this. "I never meant to hurt her," Michael said finally, his voice suddenly quieter, more vulnerable than it had been moments before. I don't know how to be a parent. I wasn't raised to be patient or understanding. I was raised to believe that discipline meant punishment, that you had to be tough with kids or they'd take advantage of you." His expression didn't change, but she continued writing notes. This was important. Michael was beginning to acknowledge the problem, beginning to recognize his own dysfunction. "Tell me about your father," said, her tone shifting slightly to one that was less accusatory and more clinical. "What was he like?" Michael was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He was difficult, angry. He used his fists more than his words, but he used both. I learned early not to mess up, because if you did, there were consequences." "And now you're doing the same thing to your daughter," observed, not unkindly. "I'm not hitting her," Michael protested weakly. "But you're using verbal abuse, emotional manipulation, and physical intimidation. You're creating the same atmosphere of fear that you grew up in," said. "Your daughter is terrified of you. She has anxiety attacks before her visits with you. She's having nightmares and regression symptoms because of the environment you create." Michael's face crumpled. For the first time, genuine emotion broke through, not anger, not defensiveness, but something that looked like remorse, or at least the beginning of awareness. I didn't realize it was affecting her that much." "Your daughter stood up in a courtroom and pointed at a police dog, calling it a bad man, because she associates authority figures and symbols of power with fear and danger. Your 3-year-old daughter is traumatized," said, her voice carrying the weight of that statement. "That's what you've created." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he placed them flat on the table. He looked away, unable to meet eyes. "What happens now?" "That depends on several things," explained. "First, you'll be required to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Second, you'll need to complete an anger management program, a real one this time, not just 4 sessions. Third, you'll need to engage in therapy to address the trauma from your own childhood and break the cycle of abuse. Fourth, your unsupervised visitation with Sarah remains suspended until the court determines it's safe to resume." Bradford interjected, "My client is willing to cooperate with all of these requirements." "There's more," continued. "The evidence we've compiled will be presented to judge for the formal custody modification hearing. Based on everything we've documented, I will be recommending to the court that supervised visitation only be resumed once Mr. Mitchell has demonstrated substantial progress in all the required programs and has received psychological clearance from a mental health professional." Michael nodded slowly, the weight of his situation finally settling on his shoulders with full force. He had thought he could win this custody fight through charm and legal maneuvering. He had thought his expensive attorney and professional facade would be enough to outmaneuver a concerned mother. He had not anticipated that his own daughter would expose him, that her simple words would set off a chain of events that would result in his entire life being examined and found deeply lacking. "I want to change," Michael said quietly. "I don't want to be like my father. I don't want Sarah to be afraid of me." It was the first honest thing he had said since the investigation began. Whether it was genuine or simply, A survival instinct recognizing that cooperation might mitigate consequences remained to be seen. But Detective took note of it anyway. Change was possible, though it would require Michael to do the hard work of confronting his own trauma and breaking patterns that had been ingrained in him since childhood. As Michael and his attorney left the interrogation room, the detective sat alone for a moment, thinking about Sarah, the brave little girl whose voice had triggered all of this. She had no idea of the power she possessed, no understanding of how her simple words had shattered the careful facade Michael had constructed. But those two words, "bad man," had ultimately been more powerful than any expensive legal team, more persuasive than any carefully crafted testimony, more effective than any amount of evidence presented by professionals. A child's truth, finally heard and believed, had changed everything. The courtroom was packed on the day of the formal custody modification hearing. News of the case had leaked to local media outlets, and several journalists occupied the gallery, their notebooks and recording devices ready to capture every detail of what had become a landmark case in family law. The case had transcended a simple custody dispute and transformed into something larger, a story about listening to children, about recognizing abuse, and about the power of intuition in the judicial system. Judge entered the courtroom with her customary authority, but there was something different about her demeanor today. She seemed even more focused than usual, her sharp eyes scanning the room before she settled into her elevated position. This case had consumed her for the past several weeks, and she was determined that her ruling would reflect both justice and the possibility of redemption through accountability and treatment. Michael sat at the defense table with Thomas Bradford, but the confident man who had begun this hearing weeks ago was gone. Michael's shoulders were hunched slightly, his expensive suit hanging on him as though he had lost weight, which he had. He looked as though he hadn't slept properly in days. Gone was the smugness, replaced by something that resembled contrition, or at least the acknowledgement of defeat. Jennifer sat at the prosecution table with Santos, Sarah sitting between them in a small chair. Sarah was dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair braided neatly by her mother. She seemed calmer than she had been weeks earlier, as though some burden had been lifted from her small shoulders simply by the act of telling the truth. Judge began by reviewing the comprehensive findings from the Child Protective Services investigation. She read portions of the investigation report into the record, documenting each finding methodically and thoroughly. She cited the testimony of teachers, pediatricians, neighbors, and mental health professionals. She presented the photographic evidence of the bruises, the medical records documenting stress-related symptoms, the therapy notes from Michael's abandoned counseling sessions. As Judge methodically laid out the case, the reality of what had transpired became undeniable. This wasn't a matter of conflicting parenting philosophies or a vindictive ex-wife making false accusations. This was documented, corroborated abuse, emotional, verbal, and physical, inflicted by a father on his vulnerable child. The evidence in this case is clear and compelling, Judge stated, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The child, Sarah Mitchell, has experienced systematic emotional abuse, verbal degradation, and physical intimidation during her time with her father. This has resulted in measurable psychological harm, including anxiety disorders, sleep disturbances, behavioral regression, and a fundamental fear of her paternal parent. She paused, allowing the weight of these statements to settle over the courtroom. "I want to acknowledge something that occurred during the initial hearing," Judge continued. A 3-year-old child, unable to articulate her experience in formal legal language, expressed her reality through 2 simple words: "bad man." Those 2 words prompted an investigation that has uncovered the truth of her situation. This case stands as a testament to the importance of listening to children, of trusting our instincts when something feels wrong, and of recognizing that justice sometimes comes from the smallest voices. Jennifer felt tears streaming down her face, and she reached over to squeeze Sarah's hand. Sarah looked up at her mother with an expression that seemed to convey understanding beyond her years. Judge then addressed Michael directly. "Mr. Mitchell, you have a history of unresolved trauma that you have attempted to recreate in your relationship with your daughter. You were subjected to abuse as a child, and you have chosen to perpetuate that cycle rather than break it. However, I want to acknowledge that you have begun to take responsibility for your actions. You have not contested these findings, and you have indicated a willingness to engage in treatment." Michael looked up, his eyes meeting the judge's gaze. "However," Judge said, her tone hardening, "acknowledgement and willingness to change are not the same as absolution. Your daughter has suffered, and that suffering has real, measurable consequences. The court cannot simply overlook what has occurred." She opened a formal document on her desk. "Therefore, this court issues the following ruling. Mr. Michael Mitchell's unsupervised visitation rights are suspended indefinitely. Supervised visitation may resume only after Mr. Mitchell has completed the following requirements. First, a comprehensive psychological evaluation demonstrating insight into his abusive behaviors and their impact on his daughter. Second, completion of a full year of intensive anger management counseling. Third, participation in a specialized parenting program for parents with histories of abuse. Fourth, individual psychotherapy addressing trauma from his own childhood, conducted by a licensed mental health professional." Judge continued, "Furthermore, any resumption of unsupervised visitation must be approved by the court following psychological evaluation by an independent mental health professional confirming that Mr. Mitchell has made substantial progress and poses no ongoing risk to his daughters." She looked directly at Michael. "You will also be responsible for paying for Sarah's ongoing therapy with a trauma specialist. The cost of these services will be in addition to your current child support obligations, which are being increased to reflect the additional expenses resulting from the emotional and psychological harm you have caused." The courtroom was absolutely silent. This was a comprehensive ruling that addressed not just custody, but also accountability, treatment requirements, and financial responsibility for the damage that had been caused. Judge then did something unprecedented. She looked at the assembled media representatives. "I understand this case has attracted media attention. I want to make a statement for the record and for public consumption. This case represents what is possible when we take children seriously, when we believe them, when we investigate their claims thoroughly, and when we prioritize their safety above all other considerations. Child abuse thrives in silence and secrecy. It is my hope that this case serves as an example to judges, social workers, teachers, and all professionals who interact with children. Listen to them. Their words, however simple, however childlike, often contain profound truth." Over the following weeks, Judge's statement resonated far beyond the courthouse. Legal journals published articles about her handling of the case. Child advocacy organizations contacted her, praising her for her intuitive recognition of abuse and her comprehensive approach to both protection and accountability. Universities invited her to speak at conferences about judicial responses to child abuse. Law schools began using her ruling as a teaching case in family law courses. Most significantly, Judge began receiving inquiries from other judges asking how she had recognized Sarah's statement as an indicator of abuse, how she had trusted her instincts enough to order an investigation. In response, Judge developed a training program for judges on recognizing subtle signs of child abuse and the importance of taking children's statements seriously, even when those statements are cryptic or expressed through children's limited vocabulary. The case became known in legal circles as the case of the two words, a shorthand reference to how a 3-year-old's simple, desperate declaration had triggered a cascade of events that had resulted in comprehensive intervention and systemic change. While Michael's journey toward genuine change and healing remained uncertain and long, what was certain was that Sarah's voice had been heard, believed, and acted upon. And in doing so, she had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond her own situation. Judge often reflected on that pivotal moment in her courtroom when Sarah had pointed at the police dog and spoken those two life-altering words. She recognized that sometimes justice doesn't arrive through perfect legal arguments or eloquent testimony. Sometimes it comes when we have the courage to pause, to listen, and to trust that a small child might know something we need to hear. In the months that followed, other judges began to implement similar protocols, creating safer spaces for children to speak, asking gentler questions, and taking children's statements more seriously. The systemic change that radiated outward from that single courtroom hearing would eventually help countless other children find their voices and receive the protection they deserved. Sarah Mitchell had changed the system simply by saying two words. 2 years had passed since that pivotal day in Judge's courtroom. 2 years since a 3-year-old girl had pointed at a police dog and spoken 2 words that would alter the trajectory of her life, and unexpectedly, the entire family law system. The transformation was remarkable, not just in Sarah's life, but in the lives of everyone whose story had intertwined with hers. Sarah Mitchell was 5 years old now, and she was a different child entirely. The anxiety that had characterized her earlier years, the nervous habits, the constant vigilance, the fear that had seemed to permeate her very being, had been replaced with the natural joy and exuberance of a healthy, thriving child. She laughed freely, played confidently with other children at her kindergarten, and showed no signs of the trauma that had once held her hostage. Her kindergarten teacher, Mrs., had reported to Jennifer that Sarah was excelling academically, demonstrating advanced reading skills and mathematical ability. More importantly, Mrs. noted that Sarah was emotionally secure, capable of forming healthy peer relationships, and demonstrating empathy and kindness toward her classmates. The stressed, withdrawn child who had suffered through her father's emotional abuse seemed like a distant memory. Sarah participated in our school play last week, Mrs. had told Jennifer during a parent-teacher conference. She played a butterfly and she was absolutely radiant on stage. She had such confidence, such presence. You could see how happy she was. It was beautiful to witness. Jennifer had cried during that conference, tears of gratitude for how far her daughter had come, tears of relief that the nightmare had finally ended, and tears of acknowledgement for the adults who had listened and believed and acted to protect her child. Sarah had continued with trauma therapy for the past 2 years, working with Dr. Michael Torres, a trauma specialist who had helped her process her experiences in age-appropriate ways. Through play therapy, art therapy, and age-appropriate conversations, Sarah had gradually been able to understand that the way her father had treated her was not her fault, that she was worthy and loved, and that the feelings she had carried, fear, confusion, shame, were understandable responses to an unsafe situation, not character flaws. Sarah has made remarkable progress, Dr. Torres had reported in his most recent evaluation. She demonstrates healthy emotional development, strong attachment to her mother, and appropriate social functioning. While she still occasionally exhibits some mild anxiety in situations that remind her of past trauma, she has developed excellent coping mechanisms and is processing her experiences in healthy ways. Jennifer had a year ago to a kind man named David, a high school history teacher who had become the positive male figure in Sarah's life that she had needed. David was patient, encouraging, and deeply committed to Sarah's. He had never attempted to replace her father, but instead had provided consistency, reliability, and unconditional support. Sarah had blossomed under his attention in a way that seemed to confirm what everyone had suspected. What she needed was safety and love, not the dangerous chaos her biological father had created. The supervised visitation with Michael had resumed approximately 18 months into the court-ordered treatment program. Judge had appointed a neutral supervisor, a trained professional named Karen, to oversee these visits. What emerged during these supervised sessions was evidence that Michael had, indeed, begun genuine work on his issues. Michael had completed the intensive anger management program and had maintained consistent attendance in psychotherapy. His therapist, Doctor, had worked with him extensively on processing the trauma from his own childhood, helping him understand how his father's abuse had shaped his parenting approach. Michael had also completed the specialized parenting program, where he had learned healthier discipline techniques, age-appropriate expectations, and emotional regulation skills. During the supervised visits, Karen observed Michael's interactions with Sarah. Initially, the visits had been awkward and strained. Michael seemed uncertain how to interact with his daughter, overly cautious and apologetic. But gradually, over months of consistent, supervised contact, something shifted. Michael began to relax slightly, to engage with Sarah in activities she enjoyed, to listen to her rather than demand compliance. "Your father seems to care about you," Sarah had told her mother after one supervised visit, her tone suggesting cautious optimism rather than certainty. It was a significant statement, not forgiveness, not the erasure of what had happened, but a recognition that Michael was trying, that he was attempting to change. 2 years post-ruling, supervised visitation had evolved to include visits in neutral settings, parks, museums, restaurants, where Karen could observe from a discreet distance. Michael had demonstrated sufficient progress that Judge had provisionally approved him for unsupervised visitation for a 3-hour period, one Saturday afternoon each month, with the understanding that this arrangement would be continuously evaluated and could be revoked if any concerns emerged. The first unsupervised visit had been terrifying for everyone. Jennifer had been anxious, Sarah had been nervous, and Michael had been deeply aware of the responsibility and opportunity before him. But it had gone well. Sarah had returned home animated and happy, reporting that her father had taken her to get ice cream and to the park, and that he had listened when she talked about her kindergarten friends. He had not raised his voice, had not criticized her, had not made her feel small or afraid. "My dad was nice today," Sarah had reported simply, as though it were a discovery rather than something that should have been baseline. Michael's transformation was neither complete nor guaranteed to be permanent, but it was undeniably real. He had taken responsibility for his actions without deflection or excuse. He had acknowledged the harm he had caused. He had done the work, the difficult, painful work, of confronting his own trauma and choosing a different path. While the relationship between Michael and Sarah would never be the uncomplicated bond it might have been without the abuse, it was becoming something healthier, a connection built on genuine effort, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. Judge had invited Sarah and her mother to her office one afternoon about 18 months after the custody ruling. Sarah, who had been hesitant at first about returning to the courthouse, had eventually agreed. Judge greeted them warmly and had spent time talking with Sarah about her kindergarten experiences, her interests, and her feelings about her life now. "Sarah, I want you to know something," Judge had said, kneeling down to Sarah's level. "You are one of the bravest people I've ever met. Do you know what you did when you said those 2 words in my courtroom?" Sarah had shaken her head, uncertain. "You told the truth when it was hard to tell the truth. You spoke up for yourself when you had every reason to be scared. And because you were brave, you changed things, not just for yourself, but for other children too. People learned from what you did. Judges learned to listen better to children. Teachers learned to pay more attention. That's the power of telling the truth." Sarah had listened solemnly, processing this information about her own significance in a way her young mind could understand. That she had mattered, that her voice had power, that speaking truth had consequences that rippled outward into the world. As the 2 years had unfolded, Sarah had become the unintended symbol of a movement toward better protection of children in the judicial system. Judge's handling of the case had inspired legislative changes in several states regarding how child abuse is investigated and how children's testimony is gathered. The training program Judge had developed had been adopted by judicial councils in multiple states. Numerous courts had implemented protocols for creating safer, more child-friendly environments for children to speak about traumatic experiences. Sarah didn't understand the full scope of her impact, of course. She was just a little girl who had found the courage to speak her truth. But that simple act of courage, pointing at a police dog and saying, "Bad man," had created a cascade of positive change that extended far beyond her own situation. One evening, as Jennifer tucked Sarah into bed, her daughter had asked a question that captured the essence of the journey they had all taken together. "Mommy, is Daddy going to be happy now?" Jennifer had paused, considering the profundity of her daughter's concern, her empathy even for the man who had hurt her. "I think Daddy is learning to be happy," she had answered. "He's learning that being kind and gentle makes people feel better than being mean, and I think the more he learns, the happier he might become." "That's good," Sarah had said, snuggling deeper into her blankets. "I'm happy now. I like being happy." "I like you being happy too," Jennifer had whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. And as Sarah drifted off to sleep, Jennifer reflected on how far they had all come, not just from the trauma and abuse, but toward a place where healing was possible, where accountability and responsibility had led to genuine change, where a small girl's 2 words had somehow managed to transform not just her own life, but the very system designed to protect children. Sarah's triumph wasn't just her own. It belonged to everyone who had listened, believed, investigated, and acted on her behalf. Together, they had proven that justice, true justice, begins when we listen to the smallest voices and believe what they tell us.